Hello and welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy of Religion. So last week we looked at the doctrine of creation, and in the next couple of weeks we'll be looking at the doctrine of the afterlife. But this week we're going to be looking at the difficult bit in between. Now, it won't have escaped your notice that life is tough. We all hit hard times, we all suffer, and we suffer in many different ways. While a minority of people seem to sail through life, for many people, both past and present, life is defined by its hardships and suffering. And we might reasonably expect this to be the case in the future as well. The fact that humans endure hardships and suffer is the cornerstone of what has become known as the problem of evil, which is our topic for this week. The problem of evil is relatively simple to formulate. If God exists, why do humans suffer? After all, God surely knows about our suffering, has the power to prevent it, and has the desire to prevent it. And yet, we still suffer. Which prompts the question, why? Now, how one answers this question depends in part on how one conceives of God. If God is conceived to be limited in power or wisdom or goodness, or perhaps in several of these things, then the why question is easy to answer, and the problem of evil turns out to be not much of a problem at all. And this is because a God limited in power, wisdom or goodness may not be able to reduce or remove suffering, or perhaps may not know how to do so. The why question is much more difficult for those who believe in the traditional notion of God, by which I mean a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good and creator of the universe from nothing. For if there were such a being, it seems clear enough that it could have created the universe completely free from all suffering, hardships, and death. It's also clear that such a being would have the knowledge to be able to do this, and perhaps the desire to do so as well, given that it is perfectly good. Yet the world is full of hardships and suffering, and it's not immediately obvious why that should be if there is a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, and creator of the universe from nothing. So the presence of hardships and suffering looks to be a much thornier problem for those who believe in the traditional notion of God than for those who do not. And of course, the traditional notion of God is the one accepted by most Jews, Christians, and Muslims. As a result, the vast majority of their writings on the problem of evil concern the traditional notion of God and why such a God allows us to suffer or even causes us to suffer. And their writings on the problem of evil are extensive. Thousands of books and articles have been written on the subject, if not tens of thousands, with the result that there are now far more writings on this topic than anyone could possibly read in their lifetime. And when you dip into this literature, you will quickly find that Jews, Christians, and Muslims approach the problem of evil in very different ways. The reason for this is that they each have different theological resources at their disposal. And this shapes the sort of response they can give. So what do I mean by that? Well, simply that each religion has its own sacred text, and these sacred texts differ in what they say. A claim that is made in one may not be made in another. And the claims made in a particular sacred text constitute a big part of the theological resources that a religion may use when dealing with issues such as the problem of evil. And in addition, a particular religion may appeal to its tradition when dealing with such issues, and this will count amongst its theological resources as well. Amongst other things, a religion's tradition consists of writings by figures that are highly respected by that religion. And I suspect an example would be helpful here. So to illustrate, consider the doctrine of original sin. This is based on the story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis and how they disobeyed God by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Now, according to St. Augustine, who was a Christian philosopher from the 4th, 5th centuries of the Common Era, according to Augustine, when Adam and Eve disobeyed God, the effects of their sin were transmitted to their offspring. And this resulted in a transformation of human nature. Because of that, all human beings now have a corrupt or depraved will, which gives them a propensity to sin, and so makes it difficult, perhaps even impossible, for them to do good without God's assistance through acts of grace. Following Augustine, some Christians have argued that the doctrine of original sin explains why there is evil in the world, or at least that portion of evil that human beings bring about. Now, hopefully it should be clear from this that the doctrine of original sin makes use of certain theological resources. First, there's a story from the book of Genesis about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Secondly, we've got writings of St. Augustine on the matter, which, as you may know, have been very influential among Christians. And it's also worth mentioning that Augustine used certain passages from the New Testament when developing the doctrine of original sin. So because of the resources used, this account of how evil came into the world is very specifically Christian in nature, and it's not endorsed by Jews or Muslims. Of course, the book of Genesis is part of the Hebrew Bible, which is the sacred text of Judaism. So Jews accept that Adam and Eve disobeyed God. Muslims also accept that Adam and Eve disobeyed God as it is stated in the Quran. But neither Jews nor Muslims accept the interpretation of St. Augustine, who was a Christian thinker. And Jews and Muslims do not accept the Christian New Testament either. As a result, neither Jews nor Muslims accept the doctrine of original sin. So it's only Christians who can or do appeal to the doctrine of original sin to explain the origin of evil. We won't consider any further Christian responses to the problem of evil now. The rest of this segment will focus on Islamic responses, while the next two segments will consider Jewish responses. If you have come across the problem of evil before, you'll probably be familiar with the idea of a theodicy. The basic aim of a theodicy is to provide a clear, rational explanation of why God allows or even brings about evil. For example, one kind of theodicy claims that God gave us all the gift of free will and isn't responsible if we use or misuse it to harm other people. That would be the free will theodicy. Another kind of theodicy claims that God only allows evil in the world when it is bound up with a greater good, such that to remove the evil would involve removing an even greater good. And that's the greater good theodicy. Theodicies like these are very philosophical in character. They are the product of philosophical thinking about why an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good being might allow evil in the world. Now, it's important to bear in mind that not every response to the problem of evil qualifies as a theodicy. And in fact, many do not, as will become clear in the rest of this segment and in the next two segments on this topic. How then is the problem of evil addressed in Islam? Well, it's sometimes claimed that Muslims are not troubled by the problem of evil at all. So one modern scholar, Shabir Akhtar, writes, or he tells us that Muslims just don't consider evil and suffering to be an argument against God. Because Muslims are undisturbed by the problem of evil, Akhtar explains that they don't bother themselves with creating theodicies. he says that Islamic thought does not view the problem of evil as fundamental. So no Muslim thinker or educated layman has identified theodicy as a project worthy of elaborate consideration. Now, if you've studied philosophy of religion before, this might come as something of a surprise. You'll have been used to seeing the problem of evil presented as a serious threat to the plausibility of religious belief, at least in the context of Christianity. But it's important to recognize that not all see it that way. The reason Muslims do not view the existence of evil as a serious theoretical problem is because in the Quran, human suffering is accorded an instrumental purpose. In other words, evil serves for the realization of God's plan. Because of this, it's no surprise to Muslims that human beings suffer. In fact, it's precisely what the Quran says will happen. Which raises the question, what is the purpose of suffering? Well, broadly speaking, the Muslim answer is, it serves either as a trial or as a punishment. Let's start with suffering as a trial. The Quran contains a number of passages which indicate that the point of creation is to test human beings. And this test is designed to reveal which of us is best in terms of piety and deeds, with God looking to reward those who have a sincere faith and who do good works. So one or other by itself isn't enough. And also, good works are supposed to arise out of faith, not out of any expectation of reward. In this matter, what is important is one's intention. So this leads us to our next question. How are we to be tested, or by what means are we to be tested? Again, the Quran contains a number of passages which offer some detail. From the two displayed on the screen, it should be clear that suffering and hardship are part of the test. But the test also includes the good things in life as well. Both are required for us to reveal what kind of person we are. After all, we might be pious and well-intentioned when times are easy, but what about in times of distress? Will our faith hold up? Will we remain well-intentioned, eager to do good? On the other hand, we might look to God when times are hard, but what about when things improve and life is easy again? Do we drift away and become complacent? These questions are answered only when we're exposed to the good and the bad. So here, right from the start, we see a difference between the way Muslims view suffering and the way atheists tend to do so when discussing the problem of evil. Whereas atheists expect God would create a world free of human suffering, Islam says that we should expect the exact opposite. In Islam, suffering is necessary because life on earth is intended to be a test rather than a utopia in which our every need is satisfied and every desire fulfilled. Consequently, the reason that atheists consider evil to be evidence against God, and Muslims do not, is that they have very different expectations as to the kind of world God would create. Atheists base their expectations on what they think an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good God ought to do, namely create a world without suffering. Muslims, on the other hand, base their expectations on the Quran, which states that the world was created as a test and that life is not meant to be an easy ride. Small wonder, then, that Muslims do not consider human suffering to be evidence against God. It's rather a necessary component in our spiritual journey, as one Islamic scholar puts it. Key to the Muslim approach to evil is the recognition of the gulf in wisdom between God and humans. When misfortune strikes us, we might struggle to see what good could possibly come of it. We might even declare it pointless. We might also wonder why some people undergo more hardships than others, and we might even insist that this is unfair. But here, the Quran stresses that God's knowledge is far superior to our own, encompassing every detail of the past, present, and future. Now, our knowledge obviously does not extend anything like that far, and this makes it impossible for us to figure out God's purpose in causing or allowing such and such an event or such and such a misfortune to happen. And likewise, it's impossible for us to figure out why some people have it worse than others. Any speculation would be just that, speculation, and it's very likely to be wide of the mark. So our limited perspective of the universe, coupled with our limited faculties, makes it impossible for us to know. God is quite literally inscrutable to us. Now, the emphasis on the enormous gap between God's knowledge and ours serves to discourage Muslims from treating suffering and its distribution in the world as some kind of intellectual matter, as something that needs to be figured out and resolved by a theodicy. Instead, suffering is much more of a practical matter. What matters is not coming up with some theoretical explanation of why God allows it, or allows it to be distributed unevenly amongst people. No, what matters is the practical question of how one responds to it. What the Quran asks of its followers is to be grateful during the good times and patient during the bad, as this will win God's favour. A patient person doesn't despair or panic. And when patience is combined with an unshakable trust in God, it's called beautiful patience. And this doesn't mean that we simply grin and bear it or become emotionally dead, because beautiful patience is compatible with fear, grief, and even complaining to God, so long as we complain only to God. And beautiful patience is also compatible with the hope or expectation that the bad times will pass. Someone who exemplifies beautiful patience trusts in the wisdom of what God does and allows to happen, even if that wisdom is not apparent to us. Now, I mentioned earlier that Islam also takes suffering to serve as punishment for sin. So let's now say a little bit about that. Chapter 7 of the Quran contains many examples of Allah punishing whole communities for their transgressions. For example, there's punishment by flood, earthquake, drought, plagues, and by other unspecified means. In these cases, the suffering appears to be a punishment and nothing more. But sometimes, suffering has a double purpose, at least for a Muslim, in that it's part of one's trials as well as a punishment. For example, suffering with an illness might be a test and a punishment combined. If there is a punishment element to the suffering, then it will serve to remove some of one's sins. And that's not insignificant, because in Muslim thought, one must be without sin in order to be rewarded in the afterlife. So it's in our interest to have sins removed in this life, even if we may not like it. When we started looking at Islam earlier, we came across the claim that Islamic philosophers have not felt the need to produce full-scale theodicies. And that is substantially correct, but it doesn't mean that Islam has nothing at all to say on the problem of evil, because it does, as we've seen. Given the Islamic view that the world was created to test us, suffering is inevitable, even for the best of us. And our trials are, in fact, an integral part of God's plan, and we are invited to see them not as a curse or a mistake, but as a blessing, enabling us to grow morally and spiritually, and so become closer to God. Hence, in Islam, the real issue with suffering is not to offer philosophical explanations of it, but the real issue is how we respond to it.